The death card of the tarot is actually just as much about life as it is about death. It represents change and has an esoteric meaning of creativity. Hello, I'm Michael J. Auger, creator of the Allcento Tarot, and today let's take a closer look at the 13th card of the Major Arcana. Instead of waiting until the end of the episode, I thought I'd change things up a bit and begin by asking you to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And please also leave me a comment. It really helps my channel to grow. Thank you so much. And now, on with the show. At the time right before the tarot was first created, the Black Death pandemic decimated the population of Europe and left a deep imprint on the collective imagination. One of the oldest still existing examples of the tarot, known as the Visconti-Sforza Madrone, or the Carrie Yale deck, features a personification of death as a grim reaper, riding a dark horse that tramples on people lying on the ground, including a cardinal whose head he indiscriminately chops off. This brings to mind a proverb by Horace from the Odes, written before the Common Era, that states, "Pale death with impartial foot knocks at the cottages of the poor and the palaces of kings." The meaning is that death comes for us all, monarchs and subjects, rich and poor, young and old. The depiction of death in this card is not entirely skeletal, but includes decomposing skin and swirly guts. He's quite the macabre creature, which I personally believe was designed as a creative way to attempt to shock the viewer into a different state of consciousness. Deliberately triggering shock in order to break free from a restrictive mindset is known as transgressive magic. This is only the 13th card after all, and we're far from the end of our journey. So death does not represent an ending. Instead, this card can be thought of as an initiation, where we embrace a creative change towards a new way of living. Our eyes are opened. And this concept is what may be hinted at by the white bandage wrapped around this Grim Reaper's head. The bandage may actually be a blindfold that has been removed. The possibility of a blindfold removed can also be seen in the depiction of death in the so-called Charles VI tarot. Similar to the Madrone, the Reaper on horseback faces left, as though to suggest he is cutting ties with the past. This card marks a true turning point in our journey, and that's exciting. To progress forward, we must kill our old way of living in order to be reborn with new purpose. In early Marseille-style depictions, the skeleton is no longer on horseback, but is seen on foot, tending a garden where human heads and other body parts grow. Although numbered, this card was often left untitled, a creative change from other cards that was most likely made from superstitious fear. Even today, there's many buildings which purposely skip over the 13th floor. However, the true meaning of this card is nothing to be afraid of. There's a popular expression, memento mori, which means remember you will die. However, this isn't meant to be morbid, but rather a reminder to make the most of life and be creative. In the version created by occultist Oswald Wirth, we continue a Marseille-style depiction, and Wirth describes this card as the active generator of universal life. Tarot cards with even numbers can be thought of as passive, but the number 13 is odd and therefore active. The previous Hanged Man card represented seeing things differently and understanding duality with passive acceptance. However, after this new way of thinking is embraced, the Death card represents taking creative action. Wirth explained that to know how to die is the great secret of the initiate. In order to evolve, we must let go of inferior ways of living. A voluntary death is required so the Freemason can be born free. The tarot deck known as the Ancient Italian is different from the earlier versions showing severed body parts and instead features symbols of power and authority, including a royal crown, a papal tiara, a shield, a sword, a spear, and a medal. There are also symbols of work and human activity, including an open book of knowledge, a saw and hammer representing craftsmanship, and a palette and brushes representing the creative arts. Everything is temporary and fades with time, but this opens the way for new possibilities. The version of this card created by Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith returns to a depiction of a skeleton riding on a horse. But this time, the horse is pale, as a reference to a passage in the book of Revelation. I looked, and behold, a pale horse. His rider's name was Death. A king is seen trampled under the horse, while a high-ranking member of the church is seen praying for mercy. A kneeling mother and child are also included in the foreground. The mother turns away in a state of denial, but the innocent child faces death with acceptance. In the background, a boat can be seen on the river, which some occultists have interpreted as the boat of Charon, the ferryman of Hades. But it could also be interpreted as the idea that the cycle of life continues to merrily flow on. Also in the background, there is a sun rising between two pillars, which hints at the promise of eternal life. This version of the Reaper is dressed in black armor, but does not carry a weapon of any kind. Instead, he holds a black flag decorated with a white mystic rose, which the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn saw as a symbol of rebirth. The Golden Dawn linked this card with the Hebrew letter Nun, meaning fish. The fish is a symbol of life beneath the waters, and is also a symbol embraced by Christianity. The Thoth Tarot, created by Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris, features a crowned skeleton of Osiris at the bottom of the Nile River, wielding a sai. There are two figures that can be seen between the legs of this skeleton, and the sai crosses the neck of the lower figure. This symbolic beheading represents a separation of the higher self of the man's head from the lower cardinal desires of the body. In addition to the sai slaying, it is also being used to stir up bubbles, creating new life. Inside the bubbles are figures that can be interpreted as the different lives of an individual soul, incarnating through the creative will of the divine. The bubbles are held together with threads, forming the phallus of Osiris. The Golden Dawn also linked this card to the zodiac sign of Scorpio. And there's a myth that when a scorpion finds itself in a position with no way out, it will sting itself to death. There's a scorpion at the very bottom of this card, trapped between a lily and lotus flowers. This scorpion can be interpreted as being trapped by illusions and limitations that can represent a denial of our infinite spiritual nature instead of living life fully with purpose. On the left side of this card is a serpent that slithers upwards around a fish. The fish is a symbol of life and can be seen as feminine, while the serpent can be seen as masculine and represents the creative aspects of death. Life and death can be seen as two curves of the same serpent. There's a dance between the ideas of living with purpose, or divine will, and unconscious living, or spiritual death. At the top of this card is an eagle, which represents the death of ego and connection to the divine. And there are threads that connect this eagle with the creative process. The scorpion, the serpent, and the eagle can be seen as different stages of the soul as it evolves upwards and eventually spreads its wings. And here's the death card from the Allcento Tarot. In this interpretation, the Reaper is not depicted as a grim skeleton, but as a beautiful lady. She has tied a white blindfold as a scarf of freedom around her neck, and also wears the key of life as a necklace. She faces to the left to cut ties with the past using a sai she holds in her left hand. And in her right hand, she holds an umbrella. In order to create new things, old ideas must be washed away, and it's raining. The stream in the background represents the eternal cycle of energy, evaporation, cloud formation, and the creation of rain that falls back into the river. Flowing upstream is the boat of Charon, carrying souls towards the sun of immortality that can be seen rising between a gateway of standing stones. Similar to older Marseille-style cards, death harvests heads in a garden. One is a young woman, and the other an old king. There's also a little daisy being pushed up. The garden is enclosed in a golden triangle that represents creativity. This symbol can also be seen on the shield of the Empress of the Allcento Tarot. The third card of the major arcana shares a creative energy with the 13th. Outside the garden, to the right, a skeleton of a fish can be seen. When a fish dies, it smells terrible. However, the rotting smell in the putrefaction stage of the alchemical process is a signal of imminent success. This is another symbol of life and rebirth. The fish was a symbol that alchemists of old equated to the idea they called first matter, which can be described as the primary thought of creative imagination. Nothing truly dies, but everything creatively changes form. And speaking of creativity, I invite you to visit my website, offbeatartwork.com, to see some of my other creative artistic creations. And in the next episode, we'll explore the virtue of temperance. I hope you'll continue the journey with me. And until then, brightest blessings on your spiritual journey.